One of the strangest things about Charles Darwin is that he spent almost 20 years hiding the idea that made him famous. Not because he thought it was wrong, because he thought it might be right. And honestly, the more I learn about Darwin, the less I saw a confident scientist genius, and the more I saw someone trapped by a realization that he couldn't escape. Because once Darwin started suspecting that species change over time, he wasn't just questioning biology, he was questioning a way of seeing the world that millions of people, including himself, had grown up with. And the weird thing is, I don't think he was afraid of being mocked, I think he was afraid of what the idea meant. Charles Darwin wasn't supposed to become a revolutionary. He studied medicine and hated it. He trained for the clergy and never seemed fully committed. For years, he looked like someone drifting through life. But during a voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, he developed a habit that would eventually change everything. He paid attention, not to dramatic events, to patterns, tiny differences, tiny inconsistencies. Little details that refused to fit the story everyone already believed. And that's something I find fascinating, because history teaches us that big discoveries arrive like lightning strikes. But they usually don't. They arrive as annoying questions, questions that keep showing up, questions that slowly start ruining your certainty. That's what happened to Darwin. The famous birds, the fossils, the islands, those weren't the discovery. The discovery was doubt. The realization that maybe species weren't fixed. Maybe life wasn't static. Maybe the natural world was constantly changing. And honestly, I think that's where this story stopped feeling hysterical to me. Because changing your mind sounds easy until your identity is attached to what you believe. Then it becomes one of the hardest things a person can do. Darwin wasn't finding strangers. He was finding assumptions he'd carried his entire life. Victorian Britain loved order. Nature was often viewed as evidence of design. Complexity suggested intention. Purpose seemed obvious. Darwin's growing theory threatened that certainty because natural selection suggested something radical. The appearance of design could emerge without anyone consciously designing every detail. The implications reached far beyond biology, and Darwin knew it. This is the part that genuinely stayed with me. Darwin didn't rush to publish. He waited and waited and waited for nearly 2 decades. Imagine carrying an idea around for that long. An idea that might change science. An idea that might also upset your friends, your colleagues, your society. I honestly don't know how you live with that. Because once Darwin saw the evidence, there was no way to unsee it. But accepting it meant walking away from something emotionally comfortable. And I think we still do this today. Not just with science, with politics, relationships, identity. We all have beliefs that feel safe. And when evidence starts pushing against them, most of us don't immediately change our minds. We hesitate. We negotiate. We look for reasons not to believe what we're seeing. Darwin was human enough to do exactly the same thing. Everything changed when another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, independently arrived at a similar theory. Suddenly, Darwin had a decision to make. In 1859, he finally published On the Origin of Species. The book would become one of the most influential works ever written. Not because it answered every question, because it changed the questions people were asking. Years later, philosopher Daniel Dennett described evolution as a kind of universal acid, an idea so powerful it dissolves old assumptions wherever it touches. And I think that's why Darwin still feels strangely modern. Not because evolution is controversial in science, it isn't, but because emotional challenge behind it never really disappeared. His theory forces a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. What happens when reality doesn't match the story we prefer? And honestly, I don't think that's a scientific question. I think that's a human question. Darwin's story isn't really about finches, or fossils, or biology. It's about following evidence somewhere you never really intended to go, and discovering that the truth can be both beautiful and deeply uncomfortable. The more I read about Darwin, the less I admired him for being right, and the more I admired him for being willing to be uncertain. Because uncertainty is painful. It feels unstable. Most people run from it. Darwin sat with it for 20 years. And maybe that's why his story still lingers. Not because he changed how we see nature, but because he reminds us how difficult it is to change how we see ourselves. And once a certain idea enters your mind, once it starts quietly rearranging the world, you don't always get to decide whether it stays. Sometimes it just does.